Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a rugged hillside in ancient Arcadia, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of wild thyme and the distant bleat of goats echoes off the rocky slopes. It's the kind of place where time seems to stretch out like the long shadows cast by Mount Selene at dusk. A remote corner of the Peloponnese, far from the bustling agoras of Athens or the marble-clad temples of Delphi. Here, in the 4th century BCE, or perhaps even earlier in the oral traditions that wove through generations, the everyday rhythms of life pulsed with a quiet insistence. Shepherds tending flocks along narrow paths worn smooth by countless hooves, women grinding barley in stone mortars under the relentless sun, and children darting between olive groves, their laughter swallowed by the wind. You can almost feel the cool dampness of a cave mouth against your skin, one of those natural hollows carved into the limestone by eons of water and weather, serving as shelter for both man and myth. This is the world into which Hermes entered, not with fanfare or thunderous proclamations, but in the soft hush of a dawn that barely disturbed the sleeping landscape. His mother, Maia, was no queen of the heavens but a nymph of the mountains, one of the Pleiades, daughters of Atlas, condemned to wander the earth in exile from the starry realms. She had chosen this isolated cave on Selene's flank for her confinement, a decision born of necessity and discretion. Zeus, ever the wanderer of divine dalliances, had come to her under cover of night, his form shrouded in mist to evade the jealous eyes of Hera. Their union was fleeting, a spark in the vast tapestry of Olympian intrigues, but it left Maia with child, retreating to this secluded spot where the world outside faded to a murmur. You might picture her there, as the ancient tellers did in the Homeric hymns, weaving rushes into cradles by the light of a single oil lamp, its flame flickering against walls etched with the faint scratches of previous inhabitants. Perhaps goatherds who had scratched tallies of their yields, or lovers who left cryptic symbols of their passing. Arcadia in those days was a land of hardy survival, where the soil clung stubbornly to the mountainsides, yielding barley and figs only after backbreaking labor with wooden plows drawn by stubborn oxen. The people, a mix of Dorian settlers and indigenous folk who traced their lineages to forgotten heroes, lived in clustered hamlets of mud-brick homes roofed with thatch, their days governed by the arc of the sun and the phases of the moon. Water was drawn from hidden springs, sacred to the nymphs like Maia, who were believed to embody the very essence of these vital flows, elusive, nourishing, yet forever just out of reach. Maia's kin were the Oreides, mountain nymphs whose presence whispered through the rustle of asphodel and the trickle of streams, inspiring both awe and practical reverence. Farmers would leave honeyed cakes at springheads to appease them, ensuring bountiful rains or gentle lambing seasons, while shepherds invoked their names in low chants to ward off wolves that prowled the higher crags. It was a spirituality woven into the mundane, where the divine wasn't a distant spectacle, but a thread in the fabric of endurance, the way a sudden hailstorm could ruin a harvest, or a well-timed dew could save it. As the night deepened on that fateful eve, Maia labored alone, her breaths steady and measured, drawing on the resilience that defined her kind. Nymphs, in the Greek imagination, were immortal yet bound to their locales, their lives a blend of ethereal grace and earthly toil. She might have hummed fragments of older songs, passed down from her sisters in the Pleiades cluster, tales of stars that wheeled overhead and the Titan father who bore the weight of the sky. The cave itself was a microcosm of this world, its floor scattered with dried leaves and the remnants of past fires. A small alcove piled with woven blankets dyed in madder root for warmth. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, carrying the faint lowing of cattle from distant pastures, herds that belonged to Apollo, the sun god whose rays would soon gild the horizon, though he was miles away in his northern domains. When the child emerged, it was with the first blush of light creeping over the eastern ridges, the dawn, that liminal hour when the world holds its breath between night and day. The hymn to Hermes, recited by rhapsodes in the agoras of the archaic period, captures this moment with a precision that speaks to the careful observation of natural cycles. Born with the dawning, at midday he played on the lyre, and in the evening he stole the cattle of far-shooting Apollo on the 4th day of the month. But let's linger here, in the immediacy of that birth, stripping away the later embellishments to uncover the human threads beneath. Maia, exhausted yet vigilant, wrapped the infant in swaddling bands of soft wool, perhaps spun from the fleeces of her own imagined flock, and placed him in a simple cradle of asphodel stalks, bound with sinew. The baby, already marked by an otherworldly vigor, quieted not with the wail of a mortal newborn, but with a gaze that seemed to pierce the dimness, his tiny fists clenching, as if grasping at the air itself. In the hours that followed, as Maia succumbed to the deep sleep of new motherhood, the cave settled into a profound stillness. Outside, the Arcadian dawn unfolded in its unhurried fashion, dew collecting on the bracken, birds stirring in the underbrush with tentative calls, and the first tendrils of mist rising from the valleys below. This was the Greece of the late Bronze Age echoes, where myths like this one likely took root in the collective memory of communities recovering from the collapses of Mycenaean palaces centuries earlier. By the time of Hesiod and Homer, around the 8th century BCE, such stories served not just as entertainment during winter feasts, but as repositories of moral and practical wisdom, lessons in hospitality, the perils of isolation, and the unpredictable gifts of the gods. Maia's solitude in the cave mirrored the lives of many women in these hills. Widows or unwed mothers eking out existence on the fringes, reliant on the goodwill of neighbors who traded cheese for cloth or shared tales over communal hearths. You can envision the practicalities that shaped this scene, the boring details that grounded the divine in the tangible. The cave's entrance, framed by a low arch of weathered stone, would have been draped with a goatskin curtain to keep out the chill drafts, its edges frayed from repeated use. Inside, a clay pot held olives preserved in brine, a staple sustenance alongside flatbreads baked on hot stones. Maia's hands, calloused from gathering herbs, pennyroyal for easing pains, dittany for wounds, now rested gently on her child, her dreams perhaps drifting to the starry origins of her lineage. The Pleiades, visible in the pre-dawn sky during certain seasons, were a navigational beacon for sailors and farmers alike, their rising signaling the time for sowing or the onset of storms. In this way, Maia's story intertwined with the agricultural calendar, a reminder that even godly births aligned with the earth's unyielding demands. As the sun climbed higher, casting slanting beams into the cave's mouth, the infant Hermes stirred. Unlike the sluggish awakenings of ordinary babes, his movements were deliberate, almost calculated, a foreshadowing of the quicksilver nature that would define him. He kicked free of his wrappings, his skin already tinged with the rosy hue of health, and regarded the world with eyes that held the gleam of nascent cunning. The air hummed with possibility, the distant rumble of a stream joining the chorus of waking nature. But what drove this child, barely hours old, to slip from his cradle and venture into the light? Was it an innate restlessness, a divine inheritance from his father's thunderous lineage, or something more prosaic, the simple curiosity of a being born into a world of wonders and wants? In the quiet of that Arcadian morning, as Maya slept on, unaware, the first threads of a greater unraveling began to weave themselves, leaving you to wonder. What secrets did the dawn whisper to this newborn god that set his tiny feet upon a path of theft and transformation? You find yourself drawn deeper into that Arcadian cave as the morning light strengthens, filtering through the narrow entrance like a tentative invitation. The air inside grows warmer now, carrying the earthy tang of damp stone mingled with the faint, sweet residue of Maya's herbal infusions, chamomile and wild mint steeped to soothe the aches of solitude. Hermes, that improbable infant, has not merely stirred, he has extricated himself entirely from the asphodel cradle, his small form wriggling with a purpose that defies the languor of newborn existence. In the Homeric hymn that preserves this tale, composed perhaps in the 7th century BCE by a rhapsode whose voice echoed through Ionian festivals, we learn he was placed not in a conventional bassinet, but in a winnowing fan, a humble agricultural tool of woven reeds used by Arcadian farmers to separate grain from chaff under the open sky. This detail, seemingly mundane, roots the divine birth in the gritty realities of rural toil. The fan's slatted sides, scarred from seasons of tossing barley against the wind, now cradling a godling whose first act would upend the pastoral order. As Maya sleeps on, her chest rising and falling in the measured cadence of exhaustion, the cave becomes a stage for Hermes's nascent ingenuity. He rolls onto his belly, goat-like hooves, foretold in the hymn as markers of his wild heritage, scraping softly against the packed earth floor, littered with shards of pottery from Maya's meager stores. These vessels, coarse and unglazed, were fashioned by local potters in nearby hamlets, their walls imprinted with the thumbprints of hands that knew the wheel's stubborn spin. Arcadia, in the Archaic period, was a realm of such unadorned persistence, a landlocked plateau ringed by mountains, where the Alpheus River wound its silver thread through valleys too steep for easy plowing. Its people, descendants of pre-Dorian stock, who clung to Bronze Age customs amid the Iron Age's uncertainties, sustained themselves through a rhythm of herding and small-scale farming. Goats and sheep predominated, their milk curdled into soft cheeses stored in reed baskets, while wheat fields clung to terraced slopes, yielding just enough to stave off famine in lean winters. Water, ever scarce, was coaxed from karst springs like the one trickling at the cave's rear, a vital pulse that nymphs like Maya were thought to guard, their essences intertwined with the land's hidden aquifers. Hermes's exploration begins tentatively, his eyes, sharp and unblinking, scanning the dim confines. He crawls toward the fire pit, cold now but ringed with ash from the previous night's embers, where Maya had roasted a handful of acorns gathered from the oak groves below. These nuts, a staple for the impoverished, were pounded into meal and mixed with honey from wild hives, a sparse diet that mirrored the endurance required of mountain dwellers. You can almost hear the scrape of his limbs as he reaches a cluster of tools laid out for Maya's daily rounds. A bronze sickle, its edge honed on river stones for harvesting asphodel and fennel. A spindle whirl of baked clay, weighted for spinning wool into thread under the shade of plane trees, and a small leather pouch stuffed with flint nodules for striking sparks. In this toolkit lies the essence of Arcadian resilience, tools passed down through generations, each bearing the patina of use. Reminders that survival here demanded not heroism, but habitual ingenuity. The quiet adaptation to a landscape that gave grudgingly. By the time the sun has cleared the eastern ridge, bathing the cave in a golden haze, Hermes has ventured to the threshold. The world outside unfolds in layers of revelation. The hillside carpeted in low scrub of Kermes oak and strawberry tree. Their berries a seasonal bounty that women like Maya foraged at dawn. Baskets slung over shoulders as they navigated goat trails etched by centuries of migration. Arcadia's daily life, as glimpsed in fragments from Pausanias's Periegesis of the 2nd century CE, revolved around these unremarkable circuits. Herders rising before light to drive flocks to higher pastures, their crooks carved from olive wood, voices calling in the Doric dialect that laced the air with its guttural warmth. Children, barefoot and clad in tunics of undyed wool, might trail behind, gathering fallen branches for kindling or startling partridges from the undergrowth. For Maya, as the eldest of the Pleiades, a constellation invoked by sailors for its May rising, signaling the onset of summer voyages, such routines were laced with a mythic solitude. Shy and reclusive, she shunned the revels of her sisters, preferring the cave's seclusion where Zeus had first sought her, his advances veiled in nocturnal mists to spare her Hera's wrath. Her days, you imagine, were marked by the slow unfurling of chores, sweeping the floor with a broom of broomcorn, its bristles shedding like autumn leaves, kneading dough from emmer wheat on a flat stone, the dough rising sluggishly in the cave's humid breath, and, in quieter moments, etching simple patterns, spirals evoking the coiling vines of Dionysian rites, onto bits of soft limestone, precursors to the graffiti found in later Arcadian shrines. It is amid this domestic hush that Hermes' mischief crystallizes. The hymn recounts how, scarce hours after birth, he slips outdoors, drawn by the lowing of distant herds, Apollo's sacred cattle, pastured in the Pierian meadows far to the north, but imagined here in the myth's elastic geography. Yet let's pause on the threshold with him, considering the sensory barrage that greets this divine babe. The crisp bite of morning air, laced with the resinous perfume of pines clinging to the slopes. The chatter of cicadas, building to a midday drone that lulled shepherds into siestas under cork oaks, and the visual feast of the valley below, where hamlets huddled like afterthoughts, clusters of one room, dwellings with hearths sunk into the earth, smoke curling from roof vents patched with clay. Life in these settlements was a tapestry of shared hardships, communal threshing floors where neighbors winnowed grain under the watchful eyes of elders, their tales of Pan, the goat-footed god of wild places, warding off the tedium of labor. Women wove at upright looms strung between posts, their shuttles clicking in counterpoint to the bleating of kids penned nearby, while men mended nets for the rare trout in mountain streams, their fingers calloused from twisting hemp fibers. Hermes, undeterred by his infancy, propels himself forward on those anomalous hooves, a detail that underscores his liminal nature. Half divine, half feral, embodying the Arcadian's own hybrid identity as both Hellenes and autochthones, born of the soil itself. He pauses at a sun-warmed boulder, its surface etched with lichen and fractal patterns, and there espies his first plaything, a tortoise ambling from the scrub, its shell a mosaic of amber and ebony, evoking the tesserae of later mosaics in Stygian temples. In the myth's swift progression, this encounter sparks his primal creativity. He lures the creature inside with a twig trailed like a lure, then slays it with a stone, its death a quiet pivot from cradle to craft. But envision the scene in its fuller, earth-bound slowness. The tortoise's deliberate pace, each leg extending with the caution of one who has traversed these hills since the Pleistocene, its eyes bead-like beacons of ancient patience. Hermes, giggling in that merry laughing way the hymn ascribes to him, mimics its gait, his hooves tapping a rudimentary rhythm on the pebble-strewn path, a foreshadowing of the Syrinx pipes that would later honor Pan. Back within the cave's embrace, as Maya stirs at last, rubbing sleep from her eyes with knuckles stained from berry picking, she discovers the cradle empty and her son returned, innocent as dawn itself, clutching the gutted shell like a talisman. The air now hums with the promise of midday, when the sun hangs implacable, baking the earth until even the goats seek shade in laurel thickets. Maya's response, unrecorded in epic verse, must have been a blend of maternal instinct and nymphic wariness, scooping him close, perhaps murmuring invocations to her Pleiad kin, stars that wheeled unseen by day but guided the night's quiet vigils. Her life, post-birth, resumed its threadbare pattern, nursing the child with milk drawn from imagined udders or foraged substitutes like goat's milk, traded from passing herders, weaving a finer shawl from nettle fibers, its fibers stinging her palms until soothed with olive oil, and scanning the horizon for signs of divine favor or peril, the cave's mouth framing views of thunderheads that could herald Zeus's distant gaze. Yet as the hours tilt toward noon, Hermes' gaze drifts outward again, fixed on the southern trails where dust clouds betray the movement of herds. Fat cattle with curved horns, their bells tinkling like forgotten melodies. The hymn compresses this into a divine sprint, but in the human scale of Arcadian time, it builds through the languid pulse of the forenoon. The sharing of bread with a neighbor who pauses at the cave, her basket heavy with figs split by ripeness. The distant call of a goat herd testing the wind for wolves. The subtle shift in light that signals the lyre's impending birth from shell and sinew. What impulse, then, stirs in this child as the shadows shorten, urging him toward a theft that will ripple through the heavens? Is it the echo of his father's thunder in his veins, or the simpler hunger of a world too vast for one small cave to contain? As the Arcadian sun crests its zenith, turning the hillside into a furnace of unrelenting gold, you sense the shift in the cave's quiet, a subtle tension, like the pause before a shepherd's pipe takes breath. Hermes, that improbable child, lingers no longer at the threshold, his hooves soft padded against the parched earth, carry him back into the dim sanctuary where Maya now fully wakes, her nymphic senses attuned to the faint scuffle of his return. She finds him amidst the clutter of her daily implements, the tortoise shell cradled in his arms like a secret unearthed from the scrub, its underbelly still warm from the sun's kiss. The Homeric hymn, in its rhythmic verses meant for recitation at Delphic festivals, hastens past this interlude to grander larcenies. But here in the unhurried weave of ordinary hours, we uncover the true cradle of creation, not thunderclaps from Olympus, but the patient alchemy of a mother's world, where divinity emerges from the detritus of survival. Maya, rising with the stiffness of one who has borne both child and isolation, kneels beside him, her fingers, nimble from years of plaiting willow withes into baskets for gathering wild greens, tracing the shell's ridged contours. Arcadia's midday brings its own rituals of respite. The world outside hushes as heat waves shimmer over the valleys, goats clustering in the scant shade of arbutus bushes, their bells reduced to sporadic tinkles. In hamlets scattered like pebbles along the Erymanthos River's tributaries, families retreat to cool interiors, men reclining on reed mats to mend leather thongs for sandals, women stirring lentil pottages in iron cauldrons over low fires, the steam carrying scents of cumin seeds foraged from rocky crevices. These were the unseen currents of Arcadian life, documented in the periploi of later travelers like Pausanias, who noted the region's unyielding self-sufficiency, its people trading salt from distant coasts for iron tools forged in crude bloomeries, their hearths fueled by scrub oak charred in hillside pits. For Maya, such exchanges were distant echoes. Her existence orbited the cave's modest hearth, where a tripod of stones supported a clay baking sheet, now cooling from the morning's flatbreads, their surfaces imprinted with the weave of corn husks. Hermes, undaunted by the shell's vacancy, begins his work with the instinctive focus of one who intuits form from void. He gathers from Maya's stores, ox sinews stretched taut from a recent hunt, perhaps bartered from a passing trapper who snared hares in noose snares of twisted yew, sheep gut cleaned in the spring's flow, its translucent coils evoking the intestines used by Arcadian healers to stitch wounds from thorn pricks or wolf bites. The cave fills with the soft sounds of improvisation, the snap of a reed stem as he fashions bridges for strings, its fibrous core echoing the pith of asphodel stalks that lined his cradle. The scrape of a stone knife, whetted on the same river-smoothed pebble Maya used for paring wild garlic bulbs. You can picture her watching, half in wonder, half in the weary pragmatism of a nymph who knows the land's gifts come laced with labor. The sinews, sourced from beasts that grazed the same commons as Apollo's imagined herds, required days of scraping and salting to prevent rot in the humid caves. Her Pleiad heritage, tied to the seasonal dance of stars that dictated planting cycles, their heliacal rising in late spring heralding the barley harvest, lent a celestial patience to her gaze, as if she foresaw this crafting as but another thread in the cosmos's loom. As afternoon shadows begin their eastward creep, lengthening across the cave floor like fingers of encroaching dusk, Hermes pierces the shell's belly with a fire-hardened awl, its tip glowing faintly from the rekindled hearth, where Maya has coaxed embers to life with a bow drill of olive wood and hemp cord. The air thickens with the acrid tang of singed horn, mingling with the herbal steam from a tisane of sage and thyme brewed to ease the day's accumulating fatigue. Outside, the Arcadian rhythm resumes in fits and starts. A distant shepherd's call, hoarse from midday thirst quenched at a dew-fed cistern lined with lime plaster. The rustle of women returning from olive presses, their amphorae sloshing with the green-gold yield, destined for lamps that would illuminate winter's long nights of storytelling. These tales, oral chains linking the Dark Age to the archaic resurgence, often featured Hermes not as thief, but as boundary crosser. His birth on Cyllene, a nod to Arcadia's role as a mythic cradle, where gods walked the earth in forms as humble as a goatherd's crook. The climax unfolds not in strife, but in synthesis, as Hermes stretches the gut strings across the shell's vault, tuning them with twists around carved pegs of boxwood. A wood prized in these mountains for its density, used by flute makers to bore the pipes of the monolos that wailed at rustic festivals. He plucks the first string, and the cave resonates with a note clear and plaintive, slicing through the hush like a sudden breeze parting the pines. The lyre, cellis in the Dorian tongue, its 7 strings later standardized in the kithara of urban poets, births in this moment, a sound that captures the duality of Hermes's lineage. The wild trill of mountain winds laced with the ordered harmony of Olympian decree. Maya, drawing him to her breast amid the fading light, hears in those vibrations the echoes of her sister's choral dances under Pleiad skies, their voices blending with the lyre's ancestors in Minoan frescoes from distant Crete, where saffron-garbed figures plucked barbitons amid bull-leaping rites. Yet here, in the cave's unpretentious gloom, the instrument is no artifact of palace splendor, but a tool of solace, its form echoing the winnowing fans and loom weights that punctuated Maya's days, implements of separation and weaving, now repurposed for melody. As evening settles, the cave transforms into a haven of nascent ritual. Hermes strumming idly, his tiny fingers already deft as a pickpocket's, eliciting scales that mimic the trickle of the rear spring, while Maya hums a lullaby fragmented from Titan lore, her voice a counterpoint soft as the wool she cards by touch in the fire's glow. The hearth crackles with twigs of lentisk, its resinous smoke curling toward a vent hole chinked with clay, carrying prayers unspoken to the night. This resolution, quiet as the settling of dust after a herd's passage, underscores the story's core. Hermes' birth not as disruption, but as quiet integration. His precocity a mirror to the Arcadians' own ingenuity. Farmers who terraced slopes with dry stone walls to defy erosion. Herders who navigated blizzards by the stars' fixed points. The lyre, in its infancy, promises more than music. It heralds the bridges Hermes would build between realms, from pastoral eves to divine assemblies. Its strings a metaphor for the sinews binding mortal toil to immortal caprice. In the broader sweep of Greek history, this tale from the hymns, circulated by the 6th century BCE amid the rise of lyric poets like Alcman, who drew on Arcadian modes for his Parthenaea, reminds us how the mundane births the mythic. The lyre's invention, embedded in daily crafts like bow-making or sieve-weaving, democratized harmony, allowing even the humblest symposium in a Theban oikos to echo Olympian feasts. Ordinary lives in Arcadia, with their cycles of sowing and shearing, fostered such sparks. The same hands that threshed grain under full moons tuned strings that would accompany Homer's verses, preserving the resilience that saw Greece through Persian invasions and Peloponnesian wars. Today, as you listen to a guitar's strum or a violin's sigh, descendants of that tortoise-shell frame, you might ponder how these hidden origins endure, whispering that even in our own shadowed corners, creation waits not for grand gestures, but for the patient pluck of the overlooked. What quiet craft in your own days might yet harmonize the chaos, turning survival's scraps into something that sings across the ages? Picture yourself amid the undulating pastures of ancient Arcadia, where the late afternoon sun drapes the landscape in a haze of amber, turning the scattered flocks into silhouettes against the rumpled folds of the caduceus foothills. This is no idyllic vision from later pastoral idyls, but the raw, unvarnished expanse of the Peloponnesian interior around the 5th century BCE, a mosaic of knee-high grasses clipped short by grazing sheep, interspersed with outcrops of jagged limestone that snag the hems of woolen cloaks. The air carries the musky undernote of lanolin from the herds, mingled with the sharper bite of dust kicked up by hooves on the packed earth trails, paths worn deep by generations of migrants and beasts alike. You might lean against a gnarled trunk of wild olive, its bark furrowed like the brows of the shepherds who pause here during their endless circuits, sipping from leather waterskins filled at dawn from the cold, pebbled beds of seasonal streams. These shepherds, the backbone of Arcadian existence, embodied a life of unyielding vigilance, their days a monotonous cadence dictated by the caprices of weather and wanderlust. In the shadow of Mount Selene, where Maya's cave clung like a forgotten memory, the herds, mostly sheep and goats, with the occasional cluster of broader cattle tended for their milk and hides, demanded constant attendance. A typical herder, perhaps a man named Phrixus in the vein of those unnamed figures evoked in Hesiod's works and days, rose before the stars faded, his chiton stiff with yesterday's sweat, to coax the flock from lowing pens of woven hazel hurdles. Breakfast was frugal, a heel of barley bread softened in whey from the previous evening's milking, or a handful of dried figs pilfered from a saddlebag slung over a mule's swayback. Tools were few but essential. A crook of seasoned ash wood, its hook curved just so for disentangling lambs from brambles, a sickle of flaked obsidian or early iron, hafted to a handle of holly for clipping thorny fodder during lean spells, and a simple knife tucked into a belt of plaited rush, used for everything from trimming hooves to carving tallies on a wax tablet to track yields for the village elder. Arcadia's terrain, a rugged plateau pocked with sinkholes and sudden ravines, bred a resilience born of necessity. Shepherds navigated by the sun's arc and the Pleiades' drift, their calls, low whistles and guttural Doric syllables, blending with the wind's sigh through cork oaks that dotted the higher ground. As the morning progressed, the flock would spill onto the commons, a vast, unfenced expanse where boundaries were honored more by custom than stone walls, lest feuds erupt over strays. Goats, nimble climbers with bells of hammered bronze tinkling like distant chimes, scaled the steeper slopes for sparse browse of arbutus leaves, while sheep huddled in the valleys, cropping the wiry fescue that survived the summer's scorch. The shepherd's vigil was punctuated by prosaic rituals, checking for foot rot in the damp hollows after rain, applying a poultice of crushed yarrow wrapped in dock leaves, separating ewes heavy with lamb from the rams, whose horns, curved like the new moon, could gore in a fit of spring fever, and scanning the horizon for predators, wolves slinking from the Eurotas gorge or eagles wheeling overhead with eyes fixed on the bleating young. Watering the herd meant a trek to a karst spring, its outflow a mere seep into a trough hollowed from bedrock, where the men cupped their hands alongside the beasts, the cool trickle a brief communion with the nymphs who, locals whispered, could withhold the flow in spiteful moods. In quieter interludes, they might whittle spans from boxwood to tally the day's grays or mend a torn leather sole on their sandals, simple affairs of layered oxhide, stitched with awls through eyelets punched by the same knife that dressed carcasses. This was the world Hermes re-entered as the sun tipped toward its westering path, his infant form belying the fleetness that carried him from Maya's cave down the serpentine trail to the pastures below. The Homeric hymn to Hermes, intoned by rhapsodes at Panathenaic gatherings around 600 BCE, compresses his journey into a divine blur, but linger with him in the human scale. The pebbled path crunching under his anomalous hooves, still tender from the morning's crawl. The brush of time against his skin, releasing oils that clung to his curls like an unspoken blessing. Born mere hours prior, or so the myth insists, aligning his feet to the 4th day of the month, a lunar marker for rituals of increase. He felt the pull of appetite, not for milk, but for the bold assertion of self. A spark kindled by the lyre's faint echoes still humming in his grasp. The cave receded behind him, its mouth a dark ellipsis against the hillside, where Maya now busied herself with the chores of containment, banking the hearth with ash to preserve embers against the night's chill, grinding a measure of emmer wheat on a saddle quern, its stone-worn concave from seasons of circular sweeps that mirrored the millstone's eternal grind. Down in the meadows, the shepherd's midday respite unfolded with the predictability of a well-worn sandal strap. They gathered under the scant shade of a plane tree, its leaves broad as a shield and veined like the tributaries of the Alpheus, sharing a skin of soured goat milk diluted with water drawn from a gourd flask stoppered with beeswax. Conversation drifted to the banal anchors of their world. The ewe that had miscarried twins at dawn, its afterbirth buried under a cairn of stones to appease chthonic spirits. The fence mender from Tegea who owed a fleece for last year's loan of salt, cured in clay pans over slow fires, or the omens in the entrails of a kid slaughtered for the pot, its liver pale but unspotted, promising a gentle lambing. These men, their faces etched by wind and worry, carried the weight of communal survival, tithes to the Dem's altar of Pan, goat-footed patron of these wilds, in the form of a libation of whey poured at crossroads marked by Hermes, rough-hewn pillars topped with phallic stones to invoke boundaries and bounty. Women rarely joined these vigils, tending steadings where they carded wool with combs of bone or wove it on warp-weighted looms, their shuttles of baked clay clicking like distant castanets. But their influence lingered in the amulets of blue faience, talismans against the evil eye, dangling from the shepherd's crooks. Hermes, threading through the undergrowth like a shadow detached from its caster, crests arise overlooking the Onchian plain, where Apollo's sacred herd, 50 broad-horned cattle of gleaming russet, their hides marked with the sun, God's sigil of a golden tripod, grazes under the lax watch of a lone attendant. In the hymn's telling, these beasts hail from Pieria, Apollo's northern seat, but the myth relocates them to Arcadia's folds for narrative intimacy, their presence a divine intrusion into mortal pastures. The old man, Eudemos perhaps, in the anonymous tradition, dozes against a boulder, his pipe of reed stem silent, unaware that the godling's gaze appraises not just the herd, but the rhythms of its keeping. The way the cattle fan out in a loose phalanx, lowing softly as they nose the clover heads heavy with dew, the trails they etch, meandering as a river's oxbow, destined to be read by trackers come morning. Hermes pauses, his breath steady, inhaling the mingled scents of dung patted into cakes for fuel and the faint char of a distant goat-herd's fire, where skewers of mutton sizzled over coals banked with white ash. This theft, nascent in his mind, draws from the land's own lexicon of cunning. The way rustlers in these hills drove off strays under moonless skies, masking tracks with dragged boughs of myrtle. Or how nymphs, elusive as mist, lured wanderers with phantom calls, leaving them to circle empty glens till dawn. Emboldened, Hermes fashions his first stratagem from the prosaic at hand, a bundle of tamarisk twigs stripped from a streamside copse, their flexible tips ideal for sweeping prints. Sandals of untanned hide, cut from a fawn's skin imagined in Maya's stores, to reverse his trail. The hymn notes his invention of fire here, too, but envision it grounded in Arcadian necessity. Rubbing a drill of spindlewood against a hearthboard of softer laurel, the friction birthing a coal nestled in tinder of milkweed floss, coaxed to flame with patient breaths that mirror the bellows of village smiths forging plowshares from bog iron. As twilight bruises the sky to indigo, the cattle stir, sensing the shift in air. The first chill from the Erymanthian heights, where snow lingered even in the equinox. The old attendant rouses, muttering a prayer to Helios for the morrow's light, oblivious to the infant shadow slipping among the beasts, his touch light as a zephyr on their flanks, urging them southward in a procession muffled by the hush of falling night. The herd moves in a column, hooves muffled on the loamy sward, but what stirs in Hermes as the first stars prick the vault above? Hunger for glory, or the simpler thrill of outwitting the day's drudgery? In the gathering dark, with the shepherd's fires winking like fallen embers across the vale, the question hangs. Will the trails he weaves hold against the dawn's unforgiving gaze? You trail Hermes through the thickening veil of twilight, the Arcadian landscape folding into itself like a shepherd's cloak at day's end, its contours softened by the hush that descends when the sun dips behind the crags of the Manalon range. The air cools swiftly now, carrying the night's first dews that bead on the grasses like tiny oracles, glistening under the emergent moon, a sliver that casts long, wavering shadows across the trail. Hermes, that fleet infant, moves with a gait that belies his hours-old frame, his hooves soft as a fawn's pads, leaving inverted prints in the loamy soil, a clever ruse drawn from the herder's own playbook of evasion. The cattle, some 50 head of Apollo's gleaming kine, plod in his wake, their broad muzzles lowered to the sward, cropping the last tender shoots before the dark claims them entirely. Their lowing is muted, a rumble deep in their throats, as if sensing the anomaly of this undersized guide whose touch on their flanks carries the weight of unspoken command. The path Hermes chooses winds southward, skirting the eastern flank of Selene where Maya's cave perches unseen, its hearth smoke now a faint plume, blending with the ground mist rising from the hollows. This route, etched by centuries of seasonal transhumance, traces the spine of a ridge where wild pears cling tenaciously to sheer drops, their unripe fruits a tart windfall for foragers in autumn. Arcadia's shepherds knew these ways intimately, committing them to memory through songs hummed over evening fires, ditties that mapped not just terrain, but the perils therein. The boggy sinkholes that swallowed unwary hooves after spring thaws, their edges fringed with sedges that masked the drop. The narrow defiles where brigands from Spartan borders lay in wait, their spears tipped with the same iron that shod plows in peacetime villages. In the 5th century BCE, as tensions simmered between Arcadian leagues and Dorian overlords, such trails doubled as veins of quiet resistance, smuggling cheese wheels or fleeces past toll stations, manned by hoplites in bronze greaves, their shields emblazoned with the lambda of Laconia. Hermes pauses at a fork where the path splits, one branch descending to the Alphaeus's pebbled ford, its waters murmuring over cobbles smoothed by the river's patient gnaw. The other climbing to a plateau of scattered holm oaks, their crowns gnarled like the knuckles of elders reciting genealogies at Deme assemblies. He veers upward, the herd compressing into a tighter file as the ground steepens, their bells, small affairs of folded sheet bronze, tuned to a somber peal, stilled by his whim or the night's dampening hush. You can almost feel the rhythm of their passage, the muffled thud of cloven feet on duff layered with last year's acorn husks, cracked open by foraging pigs in the off-season. The occasional snort as a bullock shakes its dewlap, scattering droplets that catch the starlight like fleeting jewels. This nocturnal migration in the myth's compressed timeline evokes the real migrations of Arcadian stock. Summer drives to high meadows where the grass stayed green amid the heat, returning in autumn laden with fat lambs for the Dionysia slaughters, their blood mingling with wine in craters of black figure pottery traded from Corinthian kilns. As the column crests the rise, the plateau unfolds, a bowl of undulant turf ringed by low cairns, ancient markers perhaps of Mycenaean barrows, their stones lichen-crusted and whispering of linear bee tallies long effaced by time. Here, Hermes halts the herd near a cluster of boulders, their surfaces veined with quartz that glints like veins of ore in a miner's lamplight. The hymn to Hermes, chanted in the agoras of Lesbos by the likes of Sappho 2 centuries prior, describes his slaughter of 2 beasts in this precinct, their entrails roasted over a fire kindled by his newfound art. But let's dwell in the prelude, the unhurried preliminaries that ground the divine caper in mortal method. Hermes selects a bullock and a cow of matching russet hue, their flanks unmarred save for the faint brands of Apollo's tripod, seared with a hot iron in Pyrrhian corrals where the gods' priests oversaw the rite with invocations to the Delphic oracle. He leads them aside, to a hollow screened by a thicket of myrtle, its glossy leaves the source of wreaths for local heroes' tombs, their berries crushed for dyes that stained the wool of festival cloaks. The fire's birth is a study in Arcadian pragmatism, far from Olympian fiat. Hermes gathers tinder from the forest floor, curls of birch bark peeled from saplings, their papery layers ideal for catching spark, a nest of dry grass seeded with thistledown, combed from the burrs that plagued shepherds' tunics. His drill, refashioned from a twig of ilex snapped from a wayside shrub, spins against a base of softer elder pith, the friction-building heat in the manner of goat herds igniting watchfires to signal across valleys or ward off the night's chill. Smoke curls first, acrid and teasing. Then flame leaps, fed by slivers of oak heartwood shaved with his thumbnail. A blade improvised from flint flaked on the trail, its edge keen enough for the finer work ahead. The air fills with the resinous crackle, a scent that evokes the communal pyres of Arcadian wakes, where families consigned the dead on biers of green boughs, the smoke carrying libations of milk and honey skyward to chthonic shades. As the blaze steadies, ringed with stones to contain its hunger, Hermes quarters the chosen pair with incisions precise as a butcher's in a Tegean market stall. Slits along the grain to ease the hide's removal, tendons severed at joints to yield sinews for future lyres or bowstrings. The meat, portioned into haunches and ribs, sizzles on spits of green hazel, their sap hissing as it meets the heat, juices dripping to baste the coals into florid bursts. He savors the portions raw at first, the hymn notes, his divine palate untroubled by the metallic tang of fresh blood, but envision the ritual's domestic echo. The way Arcadian hunters, returning from boar drives in the Erymanthos, shared the liver first among the company, its lobes red for portents, dark spots foretelling strife, a smooth expanse promising fertile fields. Hermes, alone under the wheeling stars, divides the rest into offerings, thigh bones wrapped in caul fat, burned to ash on the altar of unhewn rock, their savor rising as a makeshift hecatomb to the absent gods. The remainder packed into a pouch of the beast's own paunch, cured hastily over the embers to seal against spoilage on the morrow's trek. Dawn's approach finds him extinguishing the fire with sand raked from a nearby anthill, its grains fine as the whetstone dust that polished shepherd sickles, burying the sight to erase all trace save the faint char that lingers in the nostrils like a guilty afterthought. The herd, restless in the chill pre-dawn, mills about the plateau, their breath steaming in plumes that veil the eastern horizon where the first blush of Eos stains the sky. Hermes scatters the remaining bones in a stream's bed far below, weighted with pebbles to sink from sight. The waters gurgle a conspirator's whisper. His return to the cave traces a reverse arc, sandals reversed to print backward steps, trails swept with a broom of broomcorn bound at the haft with weth, tools of the trade for any herder masking a lost ewe's path from rivals' eyes. Arcadia's nights, you see, were not voids but canvases of subtle arts. The mending of hurdles with withies soaked in tannin streams to toughen against rot. The marking of rams with ruddle paste from iron oxide clays, dug from ravine faces where goat herds unearthed the pigments for body paints at Lupercalia-like rites. By the time he slips back into Maya's embrace, the lyre tucked under one arm like a swaddled sibling, the world stirs to the cock's herald in distant steadings, roosters of gamecock stock, their crows a ragged chorus sinking the commune's wake. Maya, rousing to nurse him, detects the faint smoke on his skin, mingled with the musk of cattle, but attributes it to a dream's residue, her fingers combing curls still dewy from the night's labors. The cave resumes its diurnal hush. The querns grind, resuming as she readies porridge of barley groats simmered with spring water. The spindle whirring as she twists wool into ply, its fibers sourced from the very flocks Hermes has diminished. Outside, The shepherds discover the breach at first light. The empty pasture, trampled grass leading to scuffed earth where prints vanish like mist. The old attendant's alibi drowned in the panic of recounting to his fellows over hasty draughts of posca, vinegar water sharp as regret. As the sun gilds the ridges, Apollo's distant wrath stirs in the myth's wings, but here, in the plateau's lingering smoke, Hermes dreams of strings plucked anew. What revelation awaits when brother confronts brother over vanished kine? Forgiveness forged in music, or the sharper edge of divine reckoning? You awaken with the first true light of dawn filtering through the cave's mouth, the Arcadian world outside stirring in the deliberate slowness of renewal. The way dew evaporates from the grasses in lazy curls, leaving the air crisp with the promise of another unremarkable day. Inside, Maya tends to her routines, oblivious to the night's audacity. She scatters fresh rushes on the floor to absorb the night's damp, their green blades crushed underfoot, releasing a faint, verdant scent that mingles with the lingering char of Hermes's clandestine fire, now dismissed as a dream's echo. The infant godling slumbers in her arms, his cheeks flushed from exertion masked as the bloom of health, the lyre propped nearby like a forgotten toy, its strings still humming faintly with the resonance of untuned potential. The cave's hearth, rekindled with a puff from her bellows of pig's bladder stretched over a wooden frame, warms a pot of milk-tepid porridge, stirred with a wooden spoon carved from sycamore, its handle worn smooth by the repetitive arcs that defined her mornings. A rhythm as steady as the drip of the rear spring into its clay basin. Far below, in the pastures that cradle the Onchian plain, the shepherd's discovery unfolds with the inexorability of a poorly tied snare. The old attendant, Eudemos or his mythic kin, rouses to the unnatural silence. No lowing chorus to greet the sun's ascent. No shuffle of hooves etching fresh furrows in the turf. He stumbles from his pallet of fern fronds layered over clay, his tunic askew and eyes bleary from the night's shallow sleep, broken by dreams of shadows flitting among the herd. The enclosure, a simple affair of thorn-bound hurdles stacked too high to contain the beasts, stands intact, but the ground within tells a tale of absence. Trampled clover in erratic swaths, as if the cattle had danced in confusion before vanishing. Faint drags in the dust where tails might have swept, or perhaps a branch trailed to obscure. His fellows arrive in a ragged cluster, crooks slung over shoulders like yokes, their water skins sloshing with the remnants of last night's posca, faces creased with the shared dread of shortfall. The loss of even one cow could mean a winter without hides for boots or cheese to trade at the Tegean market, where amphorae of oil fetched fleeces at rates set by the Archon's whim. They fan out along the perimeter, eyes downcast to the earth like oracles reading entrails, tracing the inverted prints that lead nowhere, dissolving into the rocky scree where Hermes's broom of broomcorn had whispered its erasure. Arcadia's trails, in this era of the 6th century BCE, were palimpsests of such mysteries. Strays reclaimed from ravines by dogs trained to scent wool across miles, their collars of bells silenced for the hunt, or feuds settled over disputed calves, oaths sworn on the bones of ancestors at boundary stones slick with libations of unmixed wine. The attendants murmur invocations to Pan, whose shrines dotted these commons, rough altars of unhewn limestone piled with pine cones and the antlers of stags. offerings to the lord of wild places who could unravel herds with a single panicked blast from his syrinx. One herder, his beard flecked with gray like the first frost on asphodel, notches a tally on his crook's shaft with a knife whose blade bears the patina of venison blood from countless field dressings, marking the tally against the moon's phase for the elder's ledger, kept on scrolls of scraped calfskin in the village's scriptorium, a dim hut where scribes etched with styluses dipped in soot ink. Word ripples outward like a stone skipped across the Alpheus, reaching the northern fringes where Apollo tends his oracles in the laurel groves of Delphi, some 200 miles removed, but bridged by the myth's swift geography. The god, in his form of golden-haired youth, clad in a chiton of fine linen fringed with saffron, died from crocus stigmas gathered at dawn by Delphic maidens, senses the breach through the subtle discord in his prophetic tripod, its bronze legs humming with a note off-key, as if strings plucked askew. He descends in a chariot drawn by swans, their wings beating a cadence that stirs the winds over the isthmus. But envision the journey's mortal echo. The couriers of the Amphictyonic League, fleet-footed runners in minimal kilts, relaying messages via torch signals from hilltop beacons fueled by olive prunings, their calves knotted from the relentless pace that carried edicts from sacred wars to harvest decrees. Apollo arrives at Selene's base by midday, his presence announced not by thunder, but by the sudden flock of ravens wheeling overhead. Their cries a ragged alarm that scatters the goats into crevices. The confrontation builds in the cave's shadowed throat, where Hermes feigns innocence with a babe's gurgle, his eyes wide as the moon's saucers, while Maya shrinks against the wall, her hands clutching a distaff like a talisman, its wool tuft the color of storm clouds. Apollo, staff in hand, a rod of bay laurel tipped with amber, sourced from the same groves where pythons sloughed their skins, demands restitution. His voice resonant as the lyre's deeper strings, echoing off the limestone vaults. The hymn captures the exchange in dactylic hexameters suited for symphotic recitals, but here, in the cave's confined air, thick with the scent of smoldering time from Maya's hasty incense, it unfolds as a negotiation grounded in Arcadian equity. The god rifling the alcove's corners, overturning baskets of dried figs split by the sun's kiss, and amphorae of lentisk honey crystallized from wild hives raided in spring. Hermes, unswaddled now, reveals the pilfered paunch, swollen with the roasted remnants, their savor a taunt that draws saliva even from divine lips, yielding it with a grin that crinkles his nascent features, a smile promising mischief's kinship. The climax crests not in blows, but in barter, as Hermes proffers the lyre, its tortoiseshell gleaming in the shaft of light, slanting from the entrance like a sunbeam through a keyhole. He plucks a scale, the notes cascading, low to high, evoking the dawn's blush over the tegatus, the wind's sigh through olive canopies, the low of cattle on distant commons, binding Apollo in enchantment. The god, who had strung his own kithara with gut from Pierian lyres crafted by Hephaestus's apprentices in volcanic forges, recognizes the instrument's novelty. Its celli's frame lighter than boxwood frames, strings tuned by pegs rather than hitches, a portability suited to the wanderer's road. In exchange, Apollo grants Hermes the caduceus, a wand of olive wood twined with fillets of white wool, later serpents in the iconography of Attic vases, and dominion over herds, thieves, and travelers, domains that interlace like the paths Hermes swept clean. The cattle, retrieved from their hidden vale where they grazed oblivious under nymphic watch, are restored, their brands unmarred save for the faint singe of adventure. Resolution settles like evening on the hillside. Apollo departs northward, the lyre slung across his back like a shepherd's scrip, its tunes to weave into Delphic paeans that would echo through the Persian wars, inspiring hoplites at Plataea with hymns that steadied shields against the Medes' arrow storm. Hermes, elevated yet tethered to the cave, suckles at Maia's breast amid the hush of returning normalcy. She resumes her weaving, the loom's warp threads stretched taut as the newly strung lyre, while outside, the shepherds recount the miracle over Zeus's milk curdled with rennet from a kid's stomach, attributing the herd's wander to Pan's whim rather than infant guile. Arcadia endures, its trails repopulated with the low of reclaimed beasts, hurdles mended with fresh withes soaked in lye baths to supple their bend. The day's loss tallied as a lesson in vigilance, the need for paired watches at calving moons, or signals of knotted cords hung from crooks to warn of prowlers. In the grander arc of Greek history, this theft, codified in the hymns by the 5th century BCE, amid the democratic stirrings of Cleisthenes, illuminates the mundane's mythic pivot. How a god's caper, rooted in pastoral sleights like trail sweeping or bone burying, forged the archetypes of cunning and reconciliation that permeated law codes from Solon's Seisachtheia debt relief to the arbitrations of interstate Amphictyones. The shepherd's vigil, with its endless rounds and overlooked prints, mirrors the quiet resiliences that buffered Greece through tyrannies and leagues, the unheralded arts of endurance that turned scarcity into surplus, isolation into alliance. Today, as you trace a GPS path through urban sprawl or audit a ledger's discrepancies, consider how those ancient trails persist in our safeguards against loss. The algorithms that track shipments like wayward herds, or the negotiations that pluck harmony from discord. What overlooked vigil in your own routines might yet avert a theft, transforming absence into the melody of return? You stand at the cusp of midday on the Arcadian plateau, where the sun hangs like a hammered bronze disk, its light diffused through a veil of high cirrus that softens the glare without granting mercy from the heat. The air shimmers with the faint haze of dust stirred by the morning's scant winds, carrying the dry, mineral tang of sun-baked earth mingled with the persistent undercurrent of lanolin from the flocks now scattered across the commons, their woolen backs rising and falling in a slow, hypnotic tide. Below the ridge where Maia's cave clings, the steadings hum with the unhurried persistence of the midday lull. A woman pauses in her winnowing, the flat basket of woven esparto grass balanced on her hip, its contents, barley chaff sifted from the morning's threshing floor of packed clay, trailing golden motes that dance in the still air before settling like forgotten prayers. Nearby, a child traces furrows in the dust with a stick of mulberry, sketching the crude outline of a herd, while an elder mends a water-skin seam with a bone needle threaded with sinew. The hide stitched from a kid's flank tanned in oak bark pits dug into the hillside, their acrid fumes a staple of the village's tanning yard, where hides steeped for weeks under layers of crushed galls. This interlude, the brief respite before the afternoon's chores reclaim the day, mirrors the rhythms of Arcadian life in the 5th century BCE, a land where time was portioned not by temple clocks, but by the earth's grudging yields. The barley reaped with sickles of recurved flint, hafted to handles of olive prunings, bound into sheaves with twists of straw that frayed under the binder's calloused palms. The olives gathered in nets spread beneath the trees, their drupes pulped underfoot in stone presses whose grooves channeled the oil into settling vats of unglazed pottery. The lees skimmed for soap or lamp fuel. The people here, a hardy amalgam of pre-Dorian holdouts and Spartan tributaries who chafed under the helot system spilling over from Laconia's borders, sustained their world through such minutiae. Communal ovens fired with the husks of last year's grain, their domes of mud brick cracked and repointed annually with lime slaked from the limestone kilns on the Erymanthos slopes, where the glow of night firings signaled to travelers the village's watchful pulse. Water, ever the tyrant, was husbanded from cisterns lined with hydraulic lime imported via mule trains from the Corinthian quarries, its scarcity breeding a frugality that extended to every drop, used first for the kneading trough, then diluted for the flock's troughs hollowed from split logs, and finally for the evening's ablutions in basins of turned yew. Into this poised hush, Hermes descends once more, the lyre slung across his back like a shepherd's scrip, its shell bumping softly against his side with each step down the goat path, where loose scree shifts underfoot, demanding the careful placement of hooves that have already traversed theft's shadowed miles. The Homeric hymn, intoned in the shaded colonnades of Delphic treasuries around 500 BCE, propels the narrative toward confrontation, but linger here in the plateau's languid sprawl, where the godling's approach stirs no immediate alarm. Only the idle glance of a goatherd pausing mid-whistle to urge a billy from the thistle patch, his pipe of bundled reeds bound with flax twine falling silent as he squints against the light. Hermes' bargain with Apollo, that pivotal exchange of theft for harmony, roots not in Olympian decree, but in the earthly arts of mediation. The village councils held under plane trees at the dem's heart, where disputes over stray ewes or boundary furrows were settled with oaths sworn on stacks of barley sheaves, the elders' crooks laid crosswise like truce staffs, their knobs carved with the spirals of perpetual renewal. Apollo arrives as the sun fractions the zenith, his form manifesting not in a blaze of solar fury, but in the subtle displacement of air, a breeze that parts the cirrus just enough to sharpen the shadows on the steading's thatch roofs, patched with reed bundles lashed to the rafters with willow withes supple from soaking in dew ponds. He is clad in the practical garb of a northern herdsman, his chiton of linen tabby weave girded with a belt of plaited rush, stained from the Pierian meadow's mud where his cattle had grazed before their Arcadian detour, the fabric sourced from the flax redded in the Tempe Valley's streams, its fibers beaten soft on washing blocks of porous tufa. In his hand, the caduceus precursor, a simple staff of cornel wood, its knots sanded smooth with rush stems and tipped with a fillet of undyed wool from the god's own flocks, symbolizing the herald's peace that would later entwine with serpents in the Attic pottery of Exechius. His presence ripples through the commons like a stone in the cistern, goats lifting heads from their brows of strawberry tree leaves, their bells tolling a desultory peal. A woman halting her spindle's whirl mid-spin, the clay waits momentum, carrying it to a sway that echoes the lyre's dormant strings. The steadings folk, sensing the shift without naming it, draw into a loose circle around a flat stone altar, unhewn limestone veined with calcite, its surface pitted from libations of whey poured at the new moon to coax the nymphs' favor for gentle calvings. Here, amid the circle of faces weathered like the bark of cork oaks, lines etched by the wind's lash and the sun's unsparing tally, Hermes confronts his brother, the lyre proffered like a truce olive branch, its leaves imagined in the staff's fillet. Apollo's initial ire, the hymn recounts, manifests in a demand for justice, his voice resonant as the Delphic tripods hum, but envision it tempered by the plateau's pragmatism, a recounting of the theft's traces, the inverted prints swept clean but lingering in the old attendant's memory, the faint char of the plateau fire buried yet scented in the dawn breeze like a guilty hearth. Hermes, unswaddled now in the myth's progression, responds with the instrument's voice, plucking a pentatonic scale that descends like the alpheos to its delta, the notes weaving through the air to mimic the cattle's low, now restored to their northern pastures, where Pierian shepherds resume their vigils, mending hurdles of woven osier with awls passed from sire to son. The bargain unfolds in increments, each concession a thread in the kinship's loom. Apollo claims the lyre for his oracular halls, where it will underpin the paeans chanted by the Pythian maidens, their voices trained in the modes that Hermes' tuning evokes. Dorian for the grave prophecies, Phrygian for the ecstatic trances induced by laurel wreaths twisted from boughs felled with adzes of iron bit hafted to ash helves. In return, Hermes receives the caduceus proper, its olive shaft later gilded in the iconography of Etruscan imports. But here a humble wand bound with the wool that shepherds carded in the evening's hush, its touch destined to soothe quarrels in the agoras of emerging polis, where arbitrators invoked it to halt the spear clash over water rights diverted by dikes of fascines piled with clay. The cattle, symbols of the dawn's stolen gleam, Apollo's solar herds whose absence dimmed the morning's light, are bartered into Hermes' domain, granting him patronage over the herders below, whose lives he now subtly steers. A sudden knowing in the tracker's eye to reclaim a stray from the ravine, or a ewe's udder swelling fuller after a libation at his roadside herm, a pillar of stacked fieldstone topped with a phallic capstone smeared with oil from the household lamp. As the sun tips westward, casting the plateau in elongated umbras that pool like ink in the furrows, the brothers clasp forearms in the Arcadian manner, wrists gripped firm as the yoke on oxen traces, a gesture sealed with the spit of oath sworn on shared bread, a crust of twice-baked biscuit flavored with the sesame traded from the Phoenician ports via the Isthmus fairs. The steadings folk, witnesses to this divine domesticity, disperse to their tasks with a renewed steadiness. The goatherd resuming his whistle, now laced with a melodic lilt borrowed from the lyre's echo. The woman restarting her spindle, the whirls spin sinking unconsciously to the caduceus's promised harmony. Maya's cave, distant on the ridge, frames this scene in its arched mouth, where she pauses in her herb gathering, fennel stalks bundled for the tisane that eased the birthing pains, their seeds ground in a mortar of serpentine stone, to watch the light gild the figures below. The dawn's theft resolved not in retribution, but in the quiet apportionment of roles. kinships forged in the mundane exchange of tools and tunes. Yet as the afternoon's chores reclaim the plateau, the rekindling of the olive press with a bellows of goatskin laced over a frame of split reed, the sorting of fleeces into grades for the fuller's vats where urine collected from the steading's middens softened the wool's crimp. What undercurrent lingers in this reconciliation? A smile returned with the dawn's light, hinting at bonds that bend but never fully break. You watch from the ridge's lip as the afternoon sun slants across the Arcadian plateau, turning the dust motes into fleeting sparks that settle on the wool of the grazing sheep, their fleeces already dusted with the fine silt from the morning's muster. The air, warmed to a languid thickness, carries the faint, yeasty whiff of the midday loaves cooling on the steading's lintel stones. Emmer dough risen in clay crocks, covered with damp cloths woven from linen tow. The fibers beaten from flax retted in the seasonal pools that dotted the lowlands after the winter's melt. Below, the circle around the altar disperses in the unhurried fashion of communal rites concluded. A herder retrieves his crook from where it leaned against a boulder, its ash shaft polished by the palm's habitual grip. The hook's curve tested against a lamb's scruff to recall its purpose. A woman gathers the scattered baskets of winnowed chaff. Their esparto weaves frayed at the rims from repeated fillings, destined for the hearth's tinderbox, where it would ignite the evening's stew of lentils simmered with wild garlic bulbs unearthed from the furrow's edges. Their papery skins peeled back like scrolls of forgotten edicts. Hermes and Apollo linger at the altar's edge, the lyre now in the sun god's hands, its shell cradled as one might a newborn lamb, fragile yet pulsing with the potential of unplucked strings. The caduceus, passed in exchange, rests lightly in Hermes's grasp, a wand of seasoned olive, its bark stripped in long curls with a draw knife whose blade, honed on a whetstone of novaculite traded from the Attic quarries, gleams with the oil residue from its last sharpening. This staff, unadorned save for the wool fillet knotted at its midpoint, fibers carded from the underwool of ewes shorn in the spring's first light, dyed in madder root pits dug into the clay soils, embodies the bargain's nascent terms. Not a scepter of dominion, but a tool of passage, its length suited to the herder's prod along a trail or the traveler's measure of a ford's depth, where the Alpheus ran shallow in summer, its bed a mosaic of cobbles that bruised the unwary hoof. The brothers' discourse, far from the hymn's lofty hexameters recited in the torchlit theaters of Syracuse, unfolds in the plateau's prosaic vernacular. Queries on the cattle's brands, seared with a hot iron forged in Pierian bloomeries, where charcoal from oak coppices fueled the bellow's roar. Assurances on the lyre's tuning, the gut string's tension adjusted with a twist of the pegs, their resonance tested against the wind's low moan through the nearby thicket of arbutus, whose leaves the goats stripped to the vein for their tannic brows. Context deepens in these exchanges, revealing the kinship's undercurrents as a reflection of Arcadian alliances, pacts forged not in marble halls, but in the shared labor of boundary rights, where neighboring demesmen drove stakes of hazel driven deep, with mallets of crab-apple to mark the commons divide, libeting the soil with unmixed wine from skins inflated like the caduceus's future serpents, coiled in dormant promise. Apollo, ever the measure of order, recounts the herd's northern vigil, The Pierian meadows, lush with clover seeded from Egyptian imports via the Thracian ports, where attendants rotated watches in shifts marked by water clocks of clay vessels pierced with bronze stylets, their drip syncing the hours to the oracle's consultations, vapors from the chasm below curling like the smoke from a goatherd's pipe. Hermes, in turn, gestures to the plateau's expanse, the trails that spiderweb from Selene's base, paths graded with gravel raked from dry stream beds, their ruts deepened by mule trains hauling amphorae of salted mutton to the Spartan markets, where helots bartered under the ephor's gaze, their loads balanced on panniers of wicker reinforced with leather straps riveted at the corners. This dialogue, laced with the mundane proofs of stewardship, the tally sticks notched with a knife's point to record the calves' weanings, the wool samples plucked to assess the fleece's staple length, brings the resolution nearer, the dawn's theft transmuted from caper to compact. The stolen light returned not in restitution, but in the equitable carve of domains. As the sun arcs toward the western escarpment, casting the steadings in a golden wash that gilds the thatch roof's eaves, overhanging lips trimmed yearly with sickles to prevent the rot that set in from the winter's damp. The brothers walk the common's perimeter, the lyre's strings humming faintly with each step, a sympathetic vibration that draws the flock's heads in idle curiosity. Apollo tests the instrument's voice against the landscape's chorus, a pluck evoking the stream's gurgle over moss-slick stones, where women filled their hydriae with water, ladled through sieves of fine mesh to strain the silt. A strum mirroring the loom's shuttle click in the hut's dim interior, where the heddles rose and fell on cords of twisted hemp, the weft thread, spun fine as spider silk from the spindle's weighted whirl, interlacing the warp in patterns that echoed the meander borders on the demesman's grave stellae. Hermes, wielding the caduceus like a herder's prod, points out the markers of his nascent patronage. A crossroads herm, a rough pillar of fieldstone stacked knee-high and topped with a smoothed boulder smeared with the fat from a recent sacrifice. Its phallic form a nod to fertility rites, where villagers poured libations of milk curdled with fig sap, the coagulum straining through cloths of undyed linen to yield the cheese for the god's portion. The steadings folk, resuming their rounds with a subtle attunement, incorporate this divine perambulation into their toil. A child trails the pair at a respectful remove, his bare feet padding the turf clipped short by the sheep's incessant nibble, clutching a switch of willow peeled to expose the white bark beneath. Used to flick at flies or mark the ewes' paths in games that mimicked the adult's drives. A fuller, his arms elbow-deep in a vat of stale urine collected in amphorae from the middens, its acrid steam rising like the oracle's fumes. Pauses to rinse his hands in a bucket of rainwater caught in a basin of concave slate. Watching as Apollo draws a melody from the lyre that syncs with the vat's stir, the wooden paddles arc dipping into the wool's sodden mass, agitated until the lanolin's oils emulsified, the fleeces emerging felted and shrunk, ready for the tenterhooks of ash frames stretched taut in the sun to dry. These observations, unremarked yet absorbed, weave the bargain into the daily fabric. Hermes's staff tapping a rhythm that steadies the plowman's furrow, its wooden beam creaking under the oxen's yoke padded with straw-stuffed sacking to prevent the chafe that blistered hides in the long hauls to the threshing floors. Apollo's tune lulling the midwife as she binds a newborn's navel with a strip of linen boiled in barley water. The infusion starch stiffening the cloth against the seepage that could sour in the heat. Deeper context emerges in the shared silences, the pauses where the brothers regard the horizon's rumple. The Minolan ranges folded ridges, terraced with dry stone walls that herders rebuilt each spring after the frosts heaved the stones askew, mortaring the gaps with mud kneaded in the hoofprints left by the flock's trampling. Arcadia's divine kinship, in this telling, mirrors the mortal bonds that buffered the land's scarcities, alliances sealed over the division of a disputed well. Its curb rebuilt with rings of baked clay fitted like barrel staves. The water rights apportioned by the turn of a notched stick passed hand to hand at the full moon's rise. The Pleiades, Maya's starry sisters, wheel overhead in the mind's eye, their cluster a navigational constant for the shepherd's night drives. The rising of Taygete signaling the autumn's descent to the coastal folds where the grass stayed verdant under the salt winds. The herds wintering in pens roofed with rush mats weighted against the gales. Hermes, glancing upward, traces a finger along the caduceus's fillet, its wool tufts evoking the swaddling bands Maya had wrapped him in, softened with the fat rendered from a hair snared in nooses of horsehair, braided by her own hands during the long vigils of pregnancy. As evening gathers, the plateau's light softening to the amber of cooling forges, where smiths quenched plowshares in troughs of stale beer, the foam hissing as it tempered the iron's edge, the bargain nears its seal. Apollo slings the lyre across his shoulder, its yoke fitting the curve of his chiton like a familiar burden, promising to integrate its voice into the Delphic rites. Paeans chanted by choristers whose robes of saffron linen, dyed in vats of crocus paste, strained through sieves of horsehair, swirled in processions along the sacred way paved with limestone, slabs hewn from the Parnassus quarries, their edges chamfered to blunt the pilgrim's tread. Hermes retains the cattle's oversight, his domain extending to the thieves who prowled these trails. Rustlers masked in goatskins cured in smokehouses of wattle screens, their halls driven under cover of fog to hidden glens where the brands were effaced with hot irons and the hides relabeled for the black markets of megalopolis. The resolution hovers, tangible as the shared crust of bread they break, a loaf from the morning's bake, its crumb dense with the grit of stone-ground meal sifted through bolting cloths of silk gauze traded from the east. Yet what fracture lingers in this mended bond? A sly glint in Hermes' eye, suggesting kinships thrive on the tension of unresolved pranks. You linger on the plateau as the evening light deepens, the sun's descent painting the western ridges in strokes of bruised plum and lingering gold. The shadows of cork oaks stretching like the fingers of elders reaching for the communal bowl at the day's close. The air cools incrementally, drawing forth the night's first chorus of crickets from the grass tufts, their scrape a counterpoint to the fading strains of Apollo's final pluck on the lyre, a lingering major third that hangs in the ether like the last wisp of smoke from a banked hearth. Hermes stands with the caduceus planted lightly in the turf, its olive shaft sinking a fraction into the loamy soil enriched by the sheep's droppings, patted into cakes and gathered for fuel in baskets of coiled palm fronds lashed with agave fiber, while Apollo shoulders the instrument, its yoke fitting the curve of his form as naturally as the herder's crook slots into the palm's callus. The steadings below pulse with the transition to twilight. A door swings on its pivot of wooden dowel greased with axle fat rendered from mutton suet, admitting the scent of stewing kid. Haunches seared in a cauldron of riveted bronze, its rivets hammered cold from wire drawn through a swage block of iron. The meat simmered with roots of orchis dug from the damp meadows where they bulbed in the spring's thaw. The climax of this divine parley resolves in the quiet apportionment of the dusk. Far from the thunderous arbitrations of Olympian assemblies imagined in later epic verse, but rooted in the Arcadian ethic of measured yield. Apollo accepts the lyre not as trophy, but as talisman. Its strings now tuned to the modes that will underpin his Delphic harmonies. The paeans intoned by choristers whose voices, trained from childhood in the gymnasium's shaded porticos, rose in tetrachords that synced the pilgrim's steps along the sacred way. Its paving stones laid in courses of tufa blocks, quarried from the Phocian hills. Their joints packed with lime mortar, slaked in troughs of rainwater, collected from the temple's gutters. In this exchange, the god gains a voice for prophecy unbound by the tripod's mute bronze, the lyre's resonance channeling the earth's subtle oracles, the rumble of distant quakes felt in the plateau's fissures, or the wind's whisper through the laurel groves where pythons sloughed their skins in seasonal coils, their shed husks crushed into poultices for the priest's visions. Hermes, in turn, claims the caduceus as emblem of his fluidity, its wool fillet a nod to the swaddling rites of the cave, where Maya had bound him in bands of the same fleecy undercoat, steeped in olive oil to soften against the newborn skin. The fabric later unraveled for the spindle's ply in the long afternoons of isolation. The outcomes cascade through the evening's hush, tangible in the steading's resumption of form. The herders, emboldened by the air's cleared tension, drive the last goats into the fold, their crooks tapping a rhythm that echoes the caduceus's tap on the earth. The pen's hurdles, woven from hazel rods coppiced in the winter's bare thickets, their ends sharpened with billhooks of flaked chert, creaking under the press of woolen flanks. A woman, her apron dusted with the flour from the evening's kneading trough, a half-buried stone basin lined with beeswax to seal the cracks, breaks the bread for the hearth circle, the loaf's crust yielding under the shared knife, its blade etched with the owner's mark from a cold forge, where hammers shaped the tang to fit the antler scale riveted with pins of copper wire. The lyre's legacy lingers in the song that rises unbidden, a herder's monody, now laced with the instrument's borrowed lilt, recounting the cattle's return as fable, the beasts materializing from the mist like dawn's reluctant gleam, their lowing a hymn to the boundaries redrawn, where Hermes' patronage ensures the stray ewes reclaim from the ravine's lip, her lamb nuzzling through the undergrowth guided by the staff's imagined prod. Resolution settles as the first stars prick the vault, the Pleiades clustering like Maya's absent sisters, their light a navigational thread for the shepherd's night vigils, when the flock's restlessness at wolves' howls prompted the kindling of signal fires on hilltops, bonfires of gorse bundles soaked in pitch from pine taps, their flare visible across the Taygetus passes to summon aid from kinsmen in neighboring glens. Apollo departs northward, his path traced by the swan's imagined wing beats, stirring the zephyrs that bend the asphodel stalks. The lyre's case fashioned from a folded kidskin oiled against the dew, slung to weather the journey's dust. Roads graded with gravel from river dredges, their culverts of terracotta pipes laid to drain the spring floods that turn the lowlands to quagmires. Hermes ascends to the cave, caduceus in hand like a wayfarer's staff, its fillet trailing threads that catch the breeze, a symbol of the kinship's enduring weave. Brothers divided by domain, yet bound by the theft's spark. The dawn stolen and restored in the smile of mutual concession, where Apollo's order tempers Hermes's caprice, and the trickster's guile leavens the seer's solemnity. Maia greets him at the threshold, her arms extended in the gesture of reclamation, the cave's interior aglow with the hearth's steady pulse. Embers coaxed from the morning's bank with a poker of charred holly, feeding flames that lick a spit of kids' ribs, the fat dripping to sizzle on the stones below, basted with a brush of rosemary dipped in brine from the salted whey. The night's quiet enfolds them. The caduceus propped against the wall beside the quern, its stone surfaces dusted with the remnants of the day's grind, a coarse meal sifted through a sieve of horsehair, stretched on a hoop of willow for the morrow's flatbreads, baked on the griddle's hot iron. This domestic hush underscores the tale's lessons. Reconciliation not as grand decree, but as the patient mending of daily frays. The fence line rebuilt after a storm's breach. Stakes driven with mallets and packed with clay from the stream's cut bank. The shared well's rights renegotiated over the turn of a water wheel of wooden paddles chained with leather thongs, its creak a metronome for the pour into the village's conduit of lead pipes, soldered at the joints with resin flux. In the sweep of Greek history, this bargain, embedded in the hymns by the 4th century BCE as Plato pondered the soul's harmonies in the Phaedo's shaded groves, illuminated the fragile alloys of kinship that stabilized the polis, alliances between tyrants and demagogues, forged in the agora's dust, where orators wielded staffs like caduceus to part the spear points, echoing the lyre's mediation in the Peloponnesian truces that paused the galley's rams at sea, their hulls caulked with pitch and oared by rowers whose chants synced to the string's imagined pull. Hermes's domains, the road's dusty leagues measured by milestones of carved limestone, the market's hagglings over amphorae stamped with the eponymous Archon seal, embodied the resilience of exchange, turning theft's void into commerce's flow. From the emporia of Piraeus, where Phoenician dyes traded for Attic grain, to the Hellenistic entrepôts of Alexandria, where scrolls of papyrus, glued at the choirs with starch paste, carried the myths to Rome's forums. Apollo's lyre evolved into the cathara of tragic stages, tuned the catharses that purged the city's fevers, its modes prescribing the dithyrambs that birthed drama's masks, carved from linen stiffened with glue over wire armatures, voices amplified through the theater's raked seats of Parian marble. Today, as you navigate a boardroom's veiled barbs or a family's quiet concessions over the dinner table, plates of communal fare, bread broken from loaves risen in the oven's steam, you might glimpse these bonds in the subtle arts of accord. The email's drafted truce, its words weighted like strings on a frame. The diplomat's wand waved in virtual halls, parting digital chasms with algorithms of consensus. In an age of fractured feeds and shadowed trails, what sly bargain in your own crossings? a returned favor laced with wit, a harmony plucked from discord's shell, might yet restore the dawn's light, reminding us that kinship endures not despite the thefts, but through the smiles that seal their return. And so, as the last tendrils of twilight weave themselves into the velvet folds of night, you find yourself easing back from the rugged edges of that ancient Arcadian world, where the plateau's gentle undulations soften into the quiet cradle of memory. The cave's mouth, once a threshold of secrets and soft lamplight, now blurs at the corners of your vision, its stone walls exhaling the day's last breath in a sigh as faint as the rustle of asphodel against the wind-swept hillside. Hermes, that sly bearer of smiles and swift-footed promises, lingers there in the hush, his caduceus leaning like a forgotten shepherd's staff against the woven reeds of Maya's humble bower, its woolen fillet catching the starlight in threads as delicate as the first dew on morning grass. The lyre's echo, once sharp with the pluck of invention, dissolves now into a distant hum, merging with the cricket's lullaby and the alphaeos' far-off murmur, a river that carves its patient way through valleys without haste or hurry. Feel the weight of the hills lifting from your shoulders, the thyme-scented air cooling against your skin like a balm drawn from hidden springs. Those same waters that nourished nymphs and wanderers alike through seasons of quiet endurance. In this softening twilight, the myths settle around you not as thunderous tales of gods and thefts, but as gentle companions, reminders that even in the ordinary rhythms of dawn's quiet theft and evening's tender return, there lies a resilience woven from the earth's unyielding threads. The cattle low faintly in their folds. The stars wheel slow and sure above the Pleiades' watchful cluster, and Maya's cave becomes a sanctuary of shared breath, where every boundary crossed blooms into kinship. Every shadow yields to the warmth of reconciliation's smile. Breathe deeply now. Let the images fade like mist before the sun's reluctant rise, carrying you toward a rest as deep and dreamless as the cave's midnight heart. The dawn you once imagined stolen slips back, soft and forgiving, wrapping you in its golden hush. Sleep comes easy here, in the lap of these ancient hills, where stories end not in clamor, but in the serene whisper of what endures, the bonds that hold, the light that returns, time and again, with a knowing grace. Rest well, dear listener. The world turns gently on. End of script. Sweet dreams.